The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
Good morning, CHD. Welcome to Pediatric Perspectives, where we are taking a look at children's health challenges from a different perspective, one that includes critical thinking. We're not afraid to give you the honest truth. My guest today is Dr. KP Stoller, and it is such a privilege to have you back on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
Dr. Stoller and I share something in common. We both spoke truth to power, if you will. We're unwilling to be unethical, and so
truth to the misuse of power.
The misuse of power, and we both ended up in one way or another losing our licenses. But you have an incredible background, and I'm not going to elaborate on your entire bio because it's incredible. Maybe at another show, but you very quickly realized there was problems with mainstream medicine. You went into integrative alternative functional medicine. You went into hyperbaric oxygen treatment. You've written a couple of amazing books. Your most recent one, Incurable Me.
Incurable Us.
That's right. Incurable Me was your first book. Incurable Us is the latest one. And that's going to be a separate episode at some point all by itself. I just love that book. We are going to tackle today the information regarding informed consent and the fact that there are no legitimate safety studies. And then also we'll touch on what does your pediatrician really know about vaccines? If you want to kick it off with just anything in your background that I missed that you want people to know before we sort of deep dive into what safety studies, if any, and what pediatricians really know.
I swallowed the red pill way back in 1989 when the hepatitis B vaccine was coming out because I thought we were required to provide informed consent. I didn't realize the 1986 Vaccine Act had relieved us of that responsibility. So I was doing my due diligence so I could provide or obtain informed consent from the parents. And the first thing was, how did they get IRB approval to test the hepatitis B vaccine on 1-day-old infants, which is, what they were recommending it for,
right?
Because it's very hard to get institutional review board approval for doing something invasive on a 1-day-old infant. That was a big question in my, head scratcher for me, how they were able to do this. Of course, we know they didn't do studies on 1-day-old infants. There were 11 kids, and the oldest one was 11, so it had nothing to do with 1-day-old infants. And the other thing I was trying to find was how are they? What justification were they using? Because there's only about 200 births a year in the United States where the mom has chronic active hepatitis,
and that's out of almost 4 million births.
Right. And so you would think, well, those are the only babies that would theoretically need perhaps to get vaccinated for hepatitis B. All those other millions of births do not need to get vaccinated for hepatitis B. And, any rationalization that, well, if they ever become a firefighter, paramedic, IV drug abuser, prostitute, they'll have the antibodies. Of course, I knew they had no idea how long these antibodies were going to last. And that were given to little kids. And I was right, way back then, my suspicions, because now we know they don't last. Those antibodies will never be around by the time those kids are teenagers. And so about 3 months went by where I was, this was, 1989. So the internet was in its infancy. And I spent about 3 months trying to figure this out. And finally, one day, the little devil on my shoulder said, hey, you think you're such a good researcher, you can't find anything on this vaccine. And the little angel popped up and said, well, maybe he can't find anything because there's nothing to find. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this vaccine's a scam, because there's nothing in the medical literature justifying it or, providing safety profile. I couldn't give informed consent if I wanted to. And
Right.
if I did, with what I know, no one would want the vaccine.
Right.
So, at that point in 1989, I says, well, pediatricians are not taught anything about vaccine other than the schedule. We're not taught, when I say we're not taught anything, I mean, we're taught nothing. How they work, what's in them, how they were developed, nothing. It's
Safety
just
concerns, nothing.
what you do.
We're told they're safe and effective. Here's the schedule.
That's the mantra, safe and effective.
Yep.
So I started investigating the other vaccines. Is there science behind the other vaccines? And one by one, as I researched them, they fell to the floor because they weren't based on science. There was no science behind them.
What did you find about the gold standard of research, the double-blind, placebo-controlled vaccine studies?
Well, they don't exist.
That's right.
You know,
There's not a single one, right?
The safety study, quote unquote, safety study on the hepatitis B vaccine with those, 11 kids, lasted 4 days.
Yeah.
That's not a safety study.
No.
That's a study to see if you have an anaphylactic reaction or you drop dead. So that was really, my turning point. Now, at that same time, and I have to mention this because you asked, well, what's your background? At the same time, the first child with autism came into my office. And I silently prayed to myself, please don't be here for autism. I don't know how to treat autism. But he was there for worms.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, I'm so relieved. I can do worms. And I prescribed mebendazole, which has become a little bit famous recently because of its anti-cancer properties. And I got a call from the mom that afternoon. What did you give my kid? He's making better eye contact. He's more verbal and he's calmer. And I said, well,
Wow.
I really don't know how this this medicine works. So I had to call up the pharmaceutical company that was making it at the time and ask them, how does this stuff work? And they said it blocks molecules of a certain molecular weight from being transported across cellular membranes. So in the case of the hapless worms, it starves them to death because the sugar moieties can't go into their body. Now, that's, of course, why mebendazole is good for cancer, because it blocks sugar from going into cancer cells, and cancer cells can only use sugar. They can't use ketones. And that's the whole concept, behind ketogenic diets and cancer. It took me a couple more years to figure out what this drug was blocking, because either this kid had something in his gut that shouldn't have been in his gut, and then it was affecting his brain, or he had something in his gut that most of us have in our guts, but it was still affecting his brain. So what was it? Well, I finally figured out it was gluten. The mebendazole was blocking gluten from being absorbed by the intestinal villi. And
Wow.
I went, well, there goes my Nobel Prize, because, if that's what it was doing, the answer is to stop eating gluten, not take a drug. Although I would have to say, if somebody has real celiac disease, where they have, not glyphosate sensitivity, but real celiac disease where they can't tolerate gluten, mebendazole would be a good thing to carry in their pockets in case, they ate something accidentally that had gluten in it. It would block its absorption. So anyways, that's how it all started. By 2004, I was invited to testify at a Congressional Oversight and Reform Committee about new developments in treating autism, because I wanted these kids to have access to third-party payers, because everything that was being used to treat autism was off-label and insurance companies wouldn't pay for it. And I was pulled aside by a top congressional aide, and I was told this: everyone in the upper echelons of government who wants to know whether vaccines are causing autism already know. They already know it, and they're not going to do anything about it, because the reparations would bankrupt the Treasury. So you're never going to see any legislation with the words autism and treatment in them together, because if a bill like that is created, it's going to become very obvious that what you're not treating is autism, but what you're treating is a vaccine injury. And that would never be allowed. And so, I left Washington, D.C. with my tail between my legs thinking, well, we're just going to have to wait till 2035 whenever one out of every 2 boys in California will have autism. And if that doesn't bring down the government that they were afraid of bringing down, I don't know what will. So I think the good news is we don't have to wait till 2035 anymore, because the lack of trust that COVID created has accelerated the suspicions that these vaccines are not good. And I mean, just this morning, I looked at something that the autism rate in Marin County, where I used to live, is crashing amongst the non-vaccinated.
They have a nice little population of unvaccinated people there in Marin County. I'm aware of a couple of the doctors who work in that area. I am incredibly intrigued that you stumbled on the other functions of mebendazole. This did not occur for me until COVID. I just thought of mebendazole as an anti-parasitic. Did you use mebendazole off-label for things like autism through the years?
So what I ended up using, of course, I researched, mebendazole thoroughly after this event, and I think the event that took place way back in 1989 was really more for me to understand that autism was not some psychiatric diagnosis, which is what it was in 1989, where the incidence, was supposedly 1 in 10,000, but it was a medical condition that had potential interventions. And so that set me completely on a new path when I, realized that. So I researched mebendazole thoroughly and found out that it had these, incredible anti-cancer properties. And, as physicians, we legally cannot treat cancer patients unless you're doing cut, poison, and burn, surgery, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy. If you try to do anything outside of that, you'll get in trouble with the authorities. So many people with cancer would come to me, and of course, like I said, we're restricted from treating them. But what I would do is I would give them a list. I went, here's a list for your wellness enhancement. And I would say, I can give you the phone numbers of everyone who's done this list. I can't give you the phone numbers of the people who didn't, for obvious reasons. And I would give them the list and, had all the sources and the references, so they just weren't taking my word for it. And mebendazole, of course, was on that list.
Fascinating.
Now, there was a period of time in the United States where no one was making mebendazole. But you could get it, outside the country. And mebendazole is, again, being made in the United States, but at an extremely high price point.
Right.
So that's where people started gravitating to febendazole, which is the veterinary equivalent of mebendazole.
To finish our discussion about vaccine safety studies, I want to ask you a few questions, because I know you've done deep dive research into this. I think you already answered the question. There were no double-blind placebo-controlled studies. So if that's true, which I've also done the research and it is true, what were they using that they were calling placebos?
Typically, what they would do is use another vaccine that, again, didn't have a safety trial behind it, and that was their placebo, comparing, one vaccine to another approved vaccine. Or they would use not a saline injection, which is what you're supposed to use. That's an inert placebo, just, salt water. What they did was take out the antigen in question, but all the other contents of the vaccine would still be present. So if there were, 850 micrograms of aluminum in the vaccine, that would be in the placebo. So, because it's usually not the antigen that causes the problem, it's all the adjuvants and the other things in the vaccines that
Right.
cause the bad reactions, but not the actual antigen itself.
Right.
So, yeah, so it was all smoke and mirrors. It was deceitful. It was fraudulent, and there was nobody watchdogging them or complaining about it.
Yeah. And they actually, folks, did this with every single vaccine that's on the childhood schedule, without exception. So you would have a control group that is actually getting all the harmful products that are within the vaccine itself compared to the vaccine itself. And the outcomes were horrible for both groups. So let's say there was 5% serious adverse events in the vaccinated group, there would be 5% serious adverse events in the quote control group. They would say, oh, well, they're the same, therefore it's safe. And that was their little trick that they did over and over every single time.
So I like to use the analogy of doing a study to see if eating hamburgers causes you to gain weight. And a hamburger with everything on it is the experimental unit, and the control is the same hamburger with the pickles removed. And so they could say, well, look, the people who ate this hamburger didn't gain any more weight than the control group.
Therefore, hamburgers are safe.
Hamburgers are safe for weight for losing weight. Yes, that's what they
Yeah,
do.
that is exactly right. That's a great example. Another big thing, in my opinion, if I want to compare a product, in this case, we're talking vaccines, with an alternative to see if it's safe, I would like to compare a group of vaccinated kids to a group of unvaccinated kids. What did you find in terms of that kind of study?
There have actually been a couple of studies that the CDC did, but well hidden because they
Mhm.
didn't like the results. The study you published showing here are the kids who got fully vaccinated, here are the kids who got partially vaccinated, here are the kids who didn't get vaccinated at all. That kind of retrospective study, that's been done, but officially the CDC hasn't done any. They say it's unethical. It's unethical to do a study to keep vaccines away from anybody would be unethical. So they can't do those studies. But the thing is, they do studies in private, and also and don't release the information if they don't want they don't want the public to know the information. This stuff never comes. This research never comes to the fore.
I remember reading about Peter Abbey's work and his colleagues in Africa. Do you recall what he found?
Yes. So probably the most interesting finding he had was that in these age-matched controls was that if you got the DPT vaccine, your all-cause mortality was 10 times greater than those who didn't get the DPT vaccine. And so it wasn't about dying from pertussis or diphtheria or tetanus. It was dying from ancillary illnesses because getting this vaccine so discombobbled the immune system of these kids that they couldn't fight off these other infections. The DPT vaccine that was used in Africa, because they're still using the old DPT vaccine, the whole cell DPT vaccine in third world countries. They use the acellular DPT in first world countries. So you can say, well, that's the DPT, that's not the DTAP. But yeah, we haven't done that. We haven't looked at all-cause mortality for the DTaP vaccine. So,
For any of them.
right. So
It feels
yeah.
like when I remember now about reading Peter Abbey's work, it's like, oh my gosh, they stumbled on a truth that was so inconvenient it had to be buried. And it feels like the establishment made the decision, we will never look at all-cause mortality because it might be information we don't want to see.
And so they say there's no evidence, but that's a lie, because if you don't look for something, that's not about no evidence. That's about you didn't look for the evidence.
Right.
So there's a difference between not looking for the evidence and saying there's no evidence. But they say that's what they say. There's no evidence.
Right. So the public health departments around the country, around the world, if you will, when they saw this information that if you look at all-cause mortality, vaccines were actually causing a massive increase in deaths, they must have responded in a way that would make sense, I'm guessing.
Crickets. No.
Crickets. That's right. It was crickets.
Now, why would we purposely be giving something that we know causes harm? Why would we be doing that? If we remove this vaccine or stop giving it without something to replace it, it will cause vaccine hesitancy. And I say, and is that a bad thing given the track record of these guys? But
Right.
that would interfere with marketing goals. And that's what this is all about. This is just about selling something to people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So we had with hepatitis B I want to touch on the duration of monitoring for side effects and why that is also a huge problem, because it's very short and you are going to miss most side effects. For Hep B, it was just a few days. What do you recall about how long they looked at side effects for other vaccines?
I mean, it's not very long. I mean, now, when I became temporarily a paraplegic from my polio injection, in 1959, 1960, that was 2 weeks after the vaccine, not 4 days or 5 days after. So a lot of these, especially these autoimmune illnesses that crop up, they don't crop up the next week. They can take months to develop. So you have to follow these children really they should be followed for years.
Autoimmune conditions can take years.
Yeah. But remember, this is not about anyone protecting anyone's health or public health, which is an oxymoron these days. This is about selling things as fast as we can to as many people as we can.
Right. The other trick I feel that was played in all the vaccine safety trials, well, safety trials that's an oxymoron, but they're not really looking at safety. But if you will, another trick is I noticed they only look at specific outcomes on these vaccine trials. And a lot of times the outcomes are irrelevant and known to be likely unaffected by the vaccine, as opposed to why not look at all health outcomes?
They know the answers ahead of time. They're not stupid. This is all about subterfuge.
Who's paying for these studies?
You mean the fake studies?
Right.
The pharmaceutical companies pay for them.
Yeah. And sadly, I think our own government in some cases is in bed with the whole process.
The CDC completely captured by, at least, the infectious disease division completely captured by pharma. In fact, I've always considered the infectious disease division of the CDC a farm team for pharmaceutical companies, where, if you do their bidding while you work for the CDC, you'll get a nice cushy job at Merck or GSK or some other, company. They're really not working for the people of the United States. They're working for their next employer. They're trying to impress their next employer.
Right.
So
right.
They do their bidding.
The other challenge we've had, and I don't know if you can speak to this at all, raw data is never made available. So pharmaceutical companies do the studies, so-called studies, and then you don't get to see the data they use to come up with the conclusions that they then present to the CDC, the American ACIP, the council on immunization practices that makes recommendations. So those people on those committees are really looking at just filtered information.
And something else that people don't know but the 1986 Vaccine Act gave full safety responsibility, not to the pharmaceutical companies. It totally removed them from safety issues and gave that to the United States government. And the CDC was supposed to present to Congress every 2 years since 1986 what they were doing to mitigate safety issues with vaccines. And do you know how many reports they submitted? Zero,
right.
They never met their obligation under the 1986 Vaccine Act.
And the consequences for not doing that?
is
Zero.
we have very dangerous vaccines on the market. That's what the
Right.
consequences are.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You started off at the beginning mentioning how pediatricians, and you and I are both started off our careers as pediatricians, what we were taught that, we didn't know what the ingredients were in these vaccines. We didn't even know how they worked. And we certainly didn't know the history about vaccination. As you've done your deep dive into the history of vaccination, the mainstream narrative is that the vaccines have cured us, eradicated smallpox and polio, et cetera. What's the reality of what actually happened from your deep dive research?
Plumbers improved the health of the public, not physicians, plumbers, because it was better sanitation, better nutrition that caused a dramatic crash in the common infectious diseases that children and people would get. And, so by the time the vaccines showed up, the incidence of these diseases had just absolutely crashed and were really not an issue. I wanted to say that it took 100 years after it was common scientific knowledge that bloodletting did not cure anybody's illness. And that was without a pharmaceutical company pushing bloodletting. But here we have an archaic medical intervention that is not doing what it says it's doing and causing harm. But you have these mega corporations pushing them because they're making so much money. They're the sacred cow of the medical cartel. So if it took 100 years to get rid of bloodletting after it was known it was not efficacious, how long is it going to take to get rid of vaccines when you have these corporations, basically mind screwing everybody about how wonderful they are?
You and I have made a career of really researching this topic, so we understand it inside and out. How do parents who don't have, they haven't spent their whole careers as you and I have done, how do they get the information that they really need to make an informed decision? What suggestions do you have for them?
The information is certainly out there now, okay? It may not have been out there in the 1980s, but it's certainly out there now. But young parents are just so trusting of authority, and that has to do with our educational system that indoctrinates people to trust authority because
Right.
they want everyone to be good worker bees. Um, and it's just unfortunate that none of these young couples are getting counseled to do due diligence about the vaccine issue, and they're just so trusting to doctors who do not deserve that trust.
In fact, it's not just young parents. My own parents who are in their 90s, my mom passed away after three COVID shots. They're also trusting. It's very interesting. They were raised in that time where, doctors know best and you don't question.
My mom, before she passed, she would ask me every month or so, should I get the COVID jab? Because, she had all these relatives telling her to get it.
Right.
And my answer to her was, do you want to die? That was always my answer to her. And I tracked what happened to all these relatives who were telling her to get the COVID vaccine. They either died or got cancer,
Yep.
which they would never admit to themselves, that's always been the problem with, autism, because with all these injured kids, there was such a psychological hurdle for parents to acknowledge that they did something that harmed their kid,
Right.
and they couldn't go there. And so we didn't see the groundswell of grassroots opposition to this medical intervention because psychologically no one wanted to admit that they injured their kids.
Who are you going to trust? Right. I, in the very beginning, trusted the establishment. You figured it out really quick with your experiences that opened your eyes, fortunately, very, very early in your career. Took me much longer. But at this point, for parents out there who might be listening, anybody who's watching this show, and they're maybe like my mom, they're going, well, Paul, how can you be right and all these other doctors wrong? So I want to ask you that same question, Dr. Stoller. How can you be right and all these other pediatricians be wrong?
I don't think it's about me being right. It's about the truth. It's about facts. I've been told that if humans are told a lie by authority figures that they trust, a physician or the president or the head of the CDC, if they are told the same lie 3 times, it doesn't matter if you come to them and spread out all the real facts and truth. They will not listen to you. And that's unfortunate, but that's what's happened.
The massive forces that are so well financed. I mean, with COVID, we saw it, billboards up, you get your COVID shot, and all these coercive measures to get people to take a shot that was not a vaccine. It did not prevent transmission. It did not make things better. You were more likely to get COVID if you got the shot. That's not what we were told. We were lied to over and over and over and over and over again. So I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to get you back someday soon. I feel like, folks, we are listening to Dr. Stoller, who lived an ethical life when it comes to understanding what he was dealing with. And you always were putting the patient's health first, which was what we were supposed to be doing. What are your final words for our viewers?
Trust but verify.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to do your own research. Remember when they were saying, don't do your own research, don't research anything. Remember that?
Yep.
And I mean, I felt saying things like natural immunity during the COVID epidemic. It was like you were saying, the N word or something. Natural immunity. We were made to feel like idiots.
Yeah.
It was very sad, and it's still going on. These COVID vaccines are still getting approved. There's just a new COVID vaccine that just got approved for 6-month-olds to 11 years old.
Right.
Why?
It's insanity. And the sad part, I thought for sure we would get that thing completely removed from the market. We know too much already. The workaround to allow it to stay on the market is, well, it's not recommended for healthy children, but we are going to allow the parents and their doctor to decide. Well, the doctors are already indoctrinated, and they're going to push it because there's financial incentives to give it.
I was in medical school when the big swine flu, push came out, and they took that off the market based on 2 people getting Guillain-Barré.
Yeah.
How many
They
millions
took
of people?
coronavirus off. There was a handful of deaths. I mean, we've had tens of thousands, if not more, deaths from these jabs.
Hundreds, if not millions.
Yeah.
Because it's an ongoing thing. Just because you didn't drop dead the next day, doesn't mean you weren't impacted by this vaccine. So
yeah. Well, Dr. Stoller, we are out of time for today. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I'm going to have you back soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And folks, look forward to seeing you next week. You can catch me at kidsfirstforever.com. I do coaching. There's a lot of information there, and it's always a pleasure to be with you.
My name is Tanya Latino.
And how many children do you have?
3.
And how many vaccines have they had?
0.
What about vitamin K?
0.
All right, what made you decide not to vaccinate your 3 children?
Way before I became a mother, I knew there was 2 things I wasn't going to do, and that was vaccinate my children and homeschool my children. Or I was going to homeschool and not vaccinate my children. And you start to question things, but you don't put the puzzle pieces together till much later. And I was a dog mom, so every time I would go to the vet, they would say, oh, is she up to date on her rabies vaccines? Does she have a rabies vaccine? I'm like, she lives in New York City. Why do they keep pushing for this rabies vaccine? And that just sparked the question, and just to start asking questions. And I started to have health problems. So when I woke up to the way the medical system was, and I was asking questions, I'm like, we're supposed to have the best health care. Why is everybody so sick? why are all the children so sick? Why are children on these medications? Why are children cancers rising? Like, I just started asking these questions, and it kept going back to the vaccine schedule. Like, you couldn't debate it. You can't. So I just started to ask those questions way before I had kids, and raising 3 healthy kids and having a natural birth and having a natural living, I see the difference between my children and the children who have been vaccinated, and it's wildly different. My children, thank you, Jesus, have never needed to go to the doctor for an ear infection, for anything, like anything that they would have, like if it was a cold or a stomach thing, I would nip it quickly with the things that I had on hand. And also prevention. Like, I was very much into preventative health, so we support their immune system. We don't negate their immune system. So I kept them very very healthy through the food I gave them, breastfeeding, and they're all thriving. You tell a lot about someone's health in their eyes, and when you study I think it's iridology, you know, like the foods that we eat, when it's heavily our bodies are just being pumped with chemicals, it affects the eyes. So my kids' eyes are pure and clear. There's no colds, there's no ear infections. They're just healthy, and if they do have something, they bounce back super quick.
How old are they now?
I have almost 6-year-old. I have a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old.
And are you afraid of measles and chickenpox and things like that?
I was never afraid of that. I was never afraid of, because I did my research prior. After birth, when a child is pumped with more vaccines, it's destroying their immune system, it's destroying their health, and you're really creating an atmosphere where it's going to be much more difficult to create health for your child later on, because you're not supporting their immune system with the right way. So I have been really adamant about standing firm in my stance and being very vocal about you can raise healthy children without vaccinating.
So, and the father of the children was totally on board. I think this is how a lot of the young people I speak to today don't know how to find someone that's totally on board with that. You have to be careful as well, right?
What's that?
We have to be careful who you marry, if you like.
You have to be very careful. You know, who you have children with is one of the biggest decisions you'll ever make, and the most important. And unfortunately, when I was with my son's dad, I thought we were completely on board. I thought this is what he was completely on board. He was just all in. And then when we got to family court, he says, "No, I'm having a little issue with our son not being vaccinated, so we're just going to pull this card." And I think it's despicable. I think it's despicable. And I think it's even worse that the courts don't even look at the facts. Here, he was all in with not vaccinating. We actually moved to Canada to avoid the vitamin K shot. We hopped to the border to move to Canada to avoid the vitamin K shot, because the vitamin K shot has a black box warning on it, which means death.
But your son didn't have to get vaccinated, right?
No.
You dealt with it?
No, if I had the birth now that I had in Canada, I would have never been able to have that birth, because he was breached, so it was a high risk birth, and they were like, "You need to do a C-section." And I'm like, "No, I trust my body," and I gave birth to him breached without drugs. So,
where do you recommend people get their research on all of this, on how to have a healthy baby? You must have researched. Do you have a medical background?
I don't, but I went to school for nutrition. After I had my health scare, I really took it upon my hands to put my health into my own hands. That's what parents really need to understand. That doctor is not there to keep your kid healthy. It's the parent's job to keep your children healthy. You need to feed them the right food. You need to support your immune system with the right, like we were talking about bone broth. That bone broth is so valuable for the immune system, and collagen and all of those great benefits. And you have to support your kids' immune system with not inundating them with toxic chemicals and the food dyes, and they're being attacked in every which way. So it's not just, I think, not vaccinating, it's a whole, it encompasses so much more. But you cannot have a healthy child if you are pumping known toxins into their body. How can you? How can you? You can't. So for me, it's diet, it's immersing yourself in knowledge. Like, I mean, the Children's Health Defense has so much material. You know, now that I am in a family court case with someone who now wants to vaccinate, I have to pull not just woo-woo stuff off I have to pull scientific facts. I have to pull all of the science stuff, and I get a lot of it from Children's Health Defense. And then there's this, there's just so many resources out right now. Mm-hmm. There's plenty. I mean, we are living in the age of knowledge. There's no excuse. With all of the books, all of the resources we have, it's, you know, there's just an abundance of information to gather. And once you know, like, you can't go back. Once you know, you don't go back to vaccinating. You can't. So, and now what I've noticed is in New York State, you know, years ago we were lobbying down at the Capitol, and now all of these parents are reaching out to me saying, you know, how can I get this exemption? I'm like, you can't. You should have been with me down at the lobby years ago, locking arms with us, because now here the war is at your doorstep. And now what are you going to do about it? So I think I personally believe vaccines are weapons of mass destruction. And I felt this way for a very long time. And I believe that it's absolutely heartbreaking what is written on that bus. And I'm just grateful that I stood firm, strongly, losing friends, losing family, people calling me crazy. My kids, thank you, Jesus, are not on that bus right now, because I stood against the grain of what people were saying I should do. I did. And even in the whole COVID era, which we may be going into again, I think parents really need to armor up and really start protecting their children, because the moment you allow them to do what they did years ago, it's not going to stop. And it's not your doctor, it's no one in office, it's nobody except the parents who can protect their children.